How are we all today? Quiet.
Good.
Good. Just a quick question before I start. How many people here are web designers? Okay, there's a couple. Web developers? Okay, a few more. Just here for some free tea and coffee? Brilliant. Good, brilliant. By the way, I'm Luke Murphy Wearmouth. If you want to find me online, I'm Lurk Moofy, if you can figure out how to spell that. It's really tiny up there, but it's bigger later, so you can find me later. I'm a web designer, a freelance web designer and developer, and I've been doing it now for about 10 years or so professionally. And one of the things that I've really noticed over the past 4 or so is that I feel like we've really grown up as an industry, which is quite exciting. But one of the things that I feel when we've reached this level of maturity is that we now need to start looking at what it is that we do and how we can make that better to really mature ourselves into a discipline, something along the lines of graphic design or print design or things like that. And one of the really exciting things about the fact that we're in this industry now, I mean, generally speaking, is everyone in here sort of part of the web-ish? Anybody not part of the web? Good. Oh, there's a couple. Okay, you might want to wait outside. Hopefully there's something in this for you. Is because we're the ones who are writing what's going to happen in the future. It's up to us to decide what happens in the future, which I think is an incredibly exciting thing. We are the ones who are going to make what we do a discipline that people will do for years and years down the line. So a large part of this, I feel, is looking at our processes, looking at the way that we do things, picking them apart and making them better, understanding how we can make them better. And this has kind of become a bit of a buzzword of late, process. Seems that everyone's talking about process. And a lot of the times when people talk about process and how we can improve it, they're looking at our heritage, where we've come from. So things like print design, graphic design, and even software design, and how we can take the elements from that and build on them to make what we do more rounded and better and more efficient and greater and all those things. Which I think is a great thing. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think that we should be looking at other established disciplines, standing on the shoulders of giants, all that kind of stuff. But I also think that we could potentially look further afield into maybe unrelated disciplines. And we can kind of see this with already happening with things like responsive web design. So responsive web design is actually, the concept of it is based from architecture, which is quite a cool concept, that they've taken this idea from architecture and then used it to inspire what is now almost a revolution within web design. So I've been looking at this, and as you may have guessed from my talk title, I used to be in the world of theatre design. So one of the many degrees that I started and never finished was in theatre. And it actually ended up meaning that whilst I was in uni and when I first got out of it, I ended up doing a lot of theatre design for amateur and semi-professional productions back in Sydney, where I'm from. And originally, when I a couple years ago, I was listening to somebody talk about how print design has really affected how they do things on the web, a guy called Elliot J. Stocks. And I thought, well, wait a second, I wonder if what I used to do in theatre could be brought into what I'm doing on the web, whether there's any nuggets of information or any interesting parts of the process that could really influence what I do on the web and make it better. So it's been about 1.5 years now of me sort of looking at this, and I've done this talk in various iterations over the past year, basically finding more and more stuff. And at the moment, I've got notebooks that are just full of random thoughts and crap that if I put it together could possibly take about 4 hours. So anybody up for that? No? Okay, cool. I might just do a condensed version then. Just a few of the things that I've pulled out. So one of the first things that I started looking at was this concept of context. Now, when you're doing a theatre design, it's quite interesting the level of research that goes into before even putting pencil to paper. And a lot of this is around these ideas of contexts. And there's 3 different contexts that you look at when you sit down as a designer with your production team. And these are your historical context, your thematic context, and your technical context. And these are all very important in shaping what it is that you do. So first off, your historical context. So every design that you produce, and I'm not talking about theater, just generally, every design that you produce will have a historical context. This can be a sort of fixed date or a general period, and can either be derived directly from content or the project itself, or it can be something that's put on by whoever owns it. In theater case, the director. They can put their own historical context on. And in theater, you use a combination of all the different areas of theater design, from lighting to sound to set design to costume design, to evoke this historical context, to establish it, get it across to the audience. And each of these require a rather ridiculous amount of research to make sure that you're getting it right and that you're getting it across as efficiently as possible. So, for example, you could use beautiful use of sort of downlighting in the lighting, rough textures in the costumes, and dim color palettes all throughout to evoke this kind of nocturnal, dirty, early 20th century London for a production like Sweeney Todd, which is the latest West End production of Sweeney Todd. Which interestingly is not the original context of the play. It's originally Victorian, but the director wanted to set it in early 20th century. Or alternatively, garish use of color, bold lines, period-specific fabrics like taffeta, to evoke 1962 Baltimore in Hairspray, which they did in the London and West End productions. So you can see they're using the design to really get this across. And similarly, in web design, we can use layouts, color palettes, typography, motion, and even audio to evoke historical periods. So this is a very specific one by Frank Camiro for a type project that he did for Microsoft, where he sort of really evoked that retro future 1960s kind of feel using color and shape and typography. And you kind of get that essence as soon as you land on the site. And it's the research into these elements that means that you can achieve this feel very quickly. And more importantly, the research can also help you avoid faux pas. So if you're doing, say, a English heritage brand, and you choose the wrong color and typography, you might get the wrong idea across. So, you know, for example, if you're doing anything English, avoid black letter. Makes kind of sense. So your thematic context. So this is an area that we're probably familiar with, sort of once we get in, but not something that we're really conscious of when we're doing designs. So from a theater point of view, we're talking about themes, subtext, overarching messages within a text. And when we transfer that concept to the web, it's quite similar. We're talking about messages our clients want to get across, the sort of general feeling they want, the intentions that they have. So while a lot of us do pay attention to these things, or I hope that we do, with things like stakeholder interviews, sort of getting down to what it is that our clients want, or that we want in a product, it's a level of detail that the designers in the theater go into that I think is quite interesting. So for example, this is a production called Kursk that went on at the Young Vic about 5 years ago. And it's about a disaster that overtook a nuclear submarine in Russia in 2000. And the design team, led by a guy called John Bosa, who's like a slight god within independent theater, actually visited a nuclear sub. I should check. Does anybody here have an interest in theater? Like, does anybody here work in theater? Oh, there's a couple. Oh, God, you're going to pick me up on some of the technicalities. No. Is anybody here interested in theater generally? OK, good. There's a few. Good, good, good. It's not going over everyone's head. So these guys actually visited a nuclear sub. They got clearance to go and live on a nuclear sub for a couple of days. They interviewed the crew. They took measurements to make sure they were getting things exact that they wanted to replicate. And also just generally getting a feel for life on a nuclear submarine so that they could evoke that mood as soon as people walked into the theater. They even noted the smell, which apparently was a mixture of diesel and urine, which is a nice thing to evoke, to get inside the context of the show and really live it and understand it before they started their designs, which seemed to work. It ended up being nominated for an Evening Standard Award, which is slightly rare for a smallish production at the Young Vic. Young Vic's not that small, but still. But taking that opportunity to live the subject matter, the intention of what you're designing for. As I said, we do this a little bit when we're doing things like stakeholder interviews, but I do think that it's important to have a deeper understanding, to actually experience the product as a customer, or if you're doing product-based design, basically to really get into the content and what it is that you're making something for, to get that additional level of insight into the why, not only the how, which we quite often get fixated on. So has anybody here been to a Web Dev Conf out in Bristol? Or anybody heard of Web Dev Conf out in Bristol? There's a couple, OK. So it's a great little conference. I've attended WDC for the last 3 years in a load of different capacities, as a sponsor, as an attendee, and as a speaker. And so it meant that I had quite an intimate knowledge of the conference, which was great when I volunteered to design this year's site. Having kind of an intimate knowledge of not only the conference and how it's run, but also the organizer, the attendees, all the rest of it really meant that I could take all of those things into consideration when coming up with a design, and it put me at ease with choosing something that wasn't particularly standard, in this case, a sort of 8-bit game style, complete with Konami codes. If you want to get on there with a really bad in-joke when you put it in, which I need to change at some point. But knowing the slightly kind of hacky, pulled-together sort of charm of the conference, which Alex has gone for, meant that this worked. It was quite rough around the edges build. It was a kind of build it until it breaks kind of mentality, which echoes how the conference is kind of run in a charming way, not in a bad way. And the good thing is it seems to have gone down well with both the attendees this year and the organizer seems to like it. So that's good. And then there's your technical context, which is really your constraints, your technical constraints. So in theater, you're talking about things like technical, so like whether there's fly space, what the stage space is like, whether there's wings, budgetary constraints, which I'm sure we're aware of, we're familiar with, and time constraints as well, something that we all love. So there's quite a few crossovers here between sort of theater and what we do. But again, it's the approach that theater designers take that I quite like, in that they see constraints as a positive thing, not something to just you have to put up with. They say they're really useful when designing as they give you something to work within, a space to work within, and often result in a simpler and more creative way of achieving things. There's actually a guy called John Driscoll who did some really big sets in the West End, things like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Ghost the Musical, and Enron. He said if you have to scratch your head about it because you couldn't do the ultimate scenario, then you end up coming up with something better. So he says you start off by thinking of the crazy ideas that you want to achieve, then bring your constraints in and find creative ways of trying to achieve them, which is quite a cool way of looking at it. So as I said, this is the first area. This is before design even happens. And then when I started to get into it, so I actually started, when I started my research, I started in set design. And then realized as I was kind of looking more and more into it that if I broadened it out to theater design, there's a lot more to look at and it's a lot more interesting. And when I say theater design, you're talking about set, costume, props, lighting, audio. It's kind of to break it down. And when you then try and marry that to web, you kind of get some quite clear correlations. So set design, that's your sort of frame, the way things are kind of positioned on a stage, quite similar to the way we look at layout. Costume design, dressing the words and the text. It's basically trying to get your content across is sort of costume design. So content design, typesetting. Props design, things to interact with. Interaction design, quite similar in the way that they approach things. Lighting design is an interesting one because there's not, obviously we don't really deal with lighting when we're designing stuff for the web. But really, when it comes down to it, it kind of matches to how we approach color, which I'll get into a bit later. And audio design was the hardest, because, I mean, we don't have audio on the web, really. Well, we do, but audio design. Audio design is audio design, exactly the same. It's quite good. And then really interestingly, the approach to theater design is quite similar in that you always start off with a base layer in a theater design, and then you add and subtract things to create scenes, which is quite similar to the way that we kind of approach templating on the web. It's quite cool. So as I said, sort of breaking this all down. So now I'm just going to kind of go through a few interesting bits that I've picked out from my research. So starting off with set design. So when you start off with, as a set designer, when you sort of have sketched your ideas, the next step usually is to create white box models. Now, a white box model is, the idea behind it is that you can show an accurate representation of what you want the set design to look like, devoid of styling, just to get an idea of how the design works, sort of once it's taken into the theater and taken beyond the initial sketches, and understanding how content can flow around the space. And keeping them devoid of color and sort of style to begin with lets you work with the design in its purest form. Understanding how things flow, how things work within it before you start getting influenced by those other elements. And it allows for a framework for the other areas of design to work within, which is quite nice. So you can do white box models in two different ways. There's sketch models, which are generally you find in smaller productions, and these are kind of very hacky, put together very quickly. It's to get the concept across as quick, and they're built as quickly and cheaply and efficiently as possible. And then there's measured models, which are built accurately. They're to scale. Quite often people will try and use the right textured sort of materials as well to sort of achieve the closest that they possibly can. Usually find these in bigger productions where the you may get into trouble if you don't have measured models. You get into the theater, you build something that costs 100 grand, and it doesn't work. So I was looking at these kind of white box models, the concept of white box models, and realized that it is quite similar. It's kind of theater's version of an interactive wireframe. The whole concept around building something quickly, cheaply, efficiently to get a working idea across to your client. They're wireframe prototypes, sort of same concept. And they allow you to make these key content, UX, and information design decisions without investing too much in the style. Also, more importantly, they help you communicate that to the client without them getting caught up in style. Because I don't know if anybody's ever had that before, where you send an initial design across, and the only feedback you get is that's the wrong brand color. So yeah, that's not what I was trying to get across to you. So these are really good for that kind of purpose. And there's a lot out there. And the really cool thing is also you can kind of take the same concepts to white box models in that you can do them in kind of sketch model style, where it is about getting something up as quickly and efficiently as possible and getting it across to the client so they can get the idea so you can then get started building it. Or measured models, where bigger sites where you actually need far more precise detail in your wireframes, far more precision in the sort of how things are laid out, especially with information design and stuff. So that's set design. So then there's costume. So it's folly to think that when you're designing costume, you're just designing clothes. It's never that simple. In fact, if you're doing something that's modern and using modern day clothes, it's probably going to be it's more deceptive in how hard it's actually going to be to design the costuming. This is because when you're designing clothes for people, you're designing for measurements. You're designing for the width of their hips, the width of their shoulders, waist. You're designing for look. Whereas when you're designing for character, you're designing for an emotional state. You're designing for sadness, for introversion, for effervescence, for extroversion. You're designing for the emotional states using quite limited palette, colors, textures, patterns, the way things are worn to help convey things about the character that aren't necessarily said. It's not only an effective way to establish character, it's actually a really effective way to get an arc in the story for a character, to sort of by changing the way that their costume is worn, the costume itself, change the costume itself, you can convey these narrative arcs in the character quite effectively without actually explicitly saying it. So for example, does anybody here know Waiting for Godot? There's a few. Waiting for Godot is a tour de force of, it's one of the greatest, absurdist plays. And if you ever get a chance to see it, it's amazing. It's generally performed every couple of years. So there's a character in the play called Pozzo. And Pozzo, this is from the second most recent New York production where John Goodman played Pozzo. And he has quite a large character change throughout the play. So in the first act, he comes on, he's a pompous, arrogant, cruel man. And I think the way that they kind of dressed him in this nicely tailored suit that isn't only about the look, it also changes the way that he carries himself, really gets the idea of the character across. It helps him convey what that character is. But as I said, he goes through quite a change. So he goes from being this pompous, arrogant man to a blind, moaning, broken fool in the second act. And his downfall is kind of achieved very simply when he first comes onto the stage in the second act by some really simple costume changes. They've taken a few things away. They've taken away his tie. They've taken away his waistcoat. The coat is actually, instead of being open and to show his extroversion, they've buttoned it up to show introversion. But not only that, they've done it slightly skew-if, so it kind of changes, it kind of changes something about saying that he isn't quite right. They've even just turned down the brim of his hat. Such a really simple thing that really gets across this kind of broken feel. And I feel like this kind of concepts, these concepts can be used quite effectively with typesetting, the way that we set our type. Because really what we're doing is we're dressing the words. So this is, from everything from choosing the appropriate fonts, typefaces, through to actually sort of typesetting and the way that we lay it out. And we know that how this can go wrong. We've all seen how this can go wrong, right? It's quite easy to screw up typesetting, and that's an extreme case, right? But the research actually suggests that it's more important than we might think. It's not just don't use Comic Sans. So a study by a guy called Kevin Larson from Microsoft and Dr. Rosalind Picard at MIT, they did this really interesting study where they looked at how good typesetting affects people. And interestingly, there wasn't a marked difference in things like reading speed and comprehension, which is what you'd probably assume good typesetting achieves. However, good typography did lead the readers to have better relative subjective duration. In other words, they could read for longer and be happier reading for longer, and increase their ability to perform well in certain cognitive tasks. So it left their mind in a better state of mind, frame of mind, whatever, afterwards. Also, quite interestingly, it induced a good mood, like consistently across the entire study. So good typesetting makes people happy. That's one, reason in itself to do good typesetting. And if there's anybody who's not familiar with the tried and tested methods of typography and typesetting, there are a lot of rules of thumb that you can play with to just get it right. Bringhurst's Elements of Typographic Style is kind of a Bible to type nerds. Any type nerds in the house? Yeah, one. Awesome. Everyone else should go and read this book, and you shall join the legions of type nerds. And in fact, actually for the web, there's, if you look up Elements of Typographic Style applied to the web, a guy called Rich Rutter has taken quite a few of the elements from this book and shown how we can implement them in CSS and JavaScript, which is quite good. It's a bit old, but it's still worth a look. However, I'm quite interested as well in the emotional states that can be triggered by playing with these rules and breaking them. So on a subtle level, you can play with things like the right amount of measure, line height, and the typeface itself to change the emotional state of the person who's reading it. So this is quite a subtle way of doing it. So this is Jason Santamaria's pretty sketchy article where he actually used handwritten text for the thing. So it doesn't follow all of the sort of tried and tested rules of good typesetting in terms of the line height isn't quite right and all the rest of it. But it gets this kind of familiar, fun kind of feel across to you when you're reading it. It makes you, it's not serious. It makes you feel quite at ease. And brands like Innocent Smoothies do this quite well with the type that they use. Conversely, you can go onto any kind of law firm site to see the effect of serious type and how the mood that can induce. But what you don't often see in typography on the web, at least, are these things taken to the extreme, which is something that I want to see more of because it's quite interesting. How we can kind of selectively discard best practice or actively go against best practice to achieve extreme results that produce extreme moods. So one of the ways off the web that you can kind of see this is sort of modern poetry, the way they do typesetting in modern poetry. Really interesting techniques with not only things like just font size, really simply, but things like measure and indentation, which actually kind of leads the user down the line and kind of makes their eyes move in a certain way. Stuff like that is quite interesting, and there are some sort of digital artists that do stuff like this, but it's not that widely used. So then there's lighting design. So I kind of mentioned that we'd get more into this. Lighting design is probably one of my favorite parts of theater design, because you can achieve some amazing results with a very small subset of tools. Because really, when it comes down to it, all that lighting designers have to play with, in essence, is hue and value, which is your color and your brightness. With this, they can create tone, mood, setting. They can pull focus to areas. All very kind of simple, but really amazing results can be achieved from it. So again, looking at something like Waiting for Godot, where you can kind of see how really sort of simple lighting can create mood and atmosphere. In fact, there's quite a few theater designers that go so far to say that good lighting design negates the need for a set. Which Waiting for Godot kind of shows this. Quite often you just see a bare stage with a tree, and everything else is done with the lighting to do things like, you know, establish time of day, establish the mood, the atmosphere of the piece, to even things like creating visual paths through a set, which you quite often see in a lot of sort of modern dance pieces, and establish sort of visual rhythm of movement, which is quite cool. And the other thing is that lighting is also an area where the constraints become quite important. So a production, the projector doesn't really kind of show the level of detail in here, but a production that I did the designs for back in Sydney. So I turned up on the day. I was used to kind of working in slightly bigger theaters with a nice big lighting rig. Most lighting rigs that you work with, even in sort of for small companies, you'd have 30 to 50 lights to play with. And quite possibly, if you were lucky, you'd even get a couple of movers, so ones that you could control from the control desk. Crazy stuff. I turned up to this theater and they had 10 lights. 10 lights that were all old school, bought in the sort of 50s and 60s. Parkans and Fresnels. So all of a sudden, I was dealing with quite extreme constraints. However, the play itself was quite a dark play, had quite dark humor. So I thought, okay, well, this is a great opportunity. And it actually led me to creating, I think, a better design than if I had a greater palette of tools to work with. Because it meant that you could embrace not only the light and lighting the correct parts of the stage, but also the darkness. Because when it comes to lighting, what you leave in the dark is just as important as what you light. Produces kind of more dramatic effects. And we can kind of see this on the web too. So this is something that I'm quite intrigued with, using color and brightness to kind of establish visual rhythm in a page or to subtly create movement. So this is kind of a very literal example. It's somebody's portfolio site, a designer in the UK, where he uses quite sort of literally lighting concepts to draw focus and create this rhythm through the page as you go down. It's quite an obvious one when it comes to lighting, but it's quite nice. It works quite well. But there's also much subtler ways that you can do this. So does anybody here read Designer News? 2. Awesome. If anybody wants an invite, it's like a Hacker News for designers. So it's all the latest news stories. If anybody wants an invite, come and talk to me afterwards. But I love the way that they quite subtly use these lighting concepts to draw focus. So you can see here, they've got a really simple design with the blue banner on the top and then the main area here. And they've used a darker color on the edges and the brighter color in the middle to kind of draw your eye into the center of the screen. So it's a small thing, but it's just a little bit of the design that just makes it better. But also there's even more subtle ways that they've used these concepts. So when you click on a link, they gray the link out, which is quite nice because the way that you read this site is you scan down the page. You don't spend much time actually reading it. You kind of scan through the titles to see something that takes your interest. If you've already read an article, then you probably don't want to read it again. So they've made your reading experience more efficient by using the lighter color so that when your eyes skim down the page, you'll actually straight away skim over the links you've already read. It's just a really nice, subtle little bit that I think works quite well. And I think that this is one of those areas that if you divorce it from your sort of normal design decisions, you could come up with quite interesting results. As always, research, user testing, and research go a ways to making sure that you don't completely screw up your site. So I would never advise putting these things into practice without testing them first, but it's something to definitely think about. So then finally, we're on to audio. Audio's a fun one. Audio and the web haven't really been good bedfellows of years. I mean, the amount of times that I've had to search for which tab in my browser is playing that god-awful noise so I can kill it. I'm so glad that Chrome finally put that little speaker icon on the tab so I can know. And I think that any site that autoplays audio deserves a special circle in hell. But I think that it's something that we could embrace a bit more. And I have noticed over the past year or so, there are more people starting to talk about audio design than what it is that we do. It's something that apps are kind of starting to get right, but the web still has a ways to catch up. So in theater, audio design is incredibly important. Apart from the obvious thing of being able to actually hear actors when they're on stage and miking and all those kind of things, there's other areas of audio design that are very, very important with getting mood and atmosphere and everything across to the audience. And it's used in kind of two ways. So there's creating texture and there's providing feedback. So sound designers use kind of layered sounds to build an atmosphere and change the emotional state of the audience. And this is something that a good sound designer, quite often, audio designer, the mark of a good audio designer is that the audience hasn't noticed that there's sound playing. Because it's so subtle and so ingrained into the piece itself that it's just triggering that emotional mood and not making itself known, which is quite nice. And this is something that I don't think that we've touched on at all in the web. And actually, I think that within technology as a whole, we haven't really picked up on the subtlety of audio design yet. I mean, take alarms, for example. Has anybody here had a Nokia in the early 2000s? Yeah? Does anybody remember the alarm sound? It's amazing. So this was my Nokia. And the sounds that it produced. See if I can get that again. Is it? Oh, it's not plugged in. That might help. That's an alarm. That's to wake you up in the morning. That's not good audio design. In fact, it doesn't quite capture the subtlety of it, actually, because you know those first two beeps that basically just burst your eardrums? Those are really quiet on the Nokia. And they kind of give you an idea of what's to come with the ear-piercing beep afterwards. It got to a point where I would use this to wake up every day. And does anybody get phantom vibrations if they keep their phone in the pocket? Yeah, so I used to hear phantom alarm tones. I used to be in my work and I'd hear these two beeps. And it would actually set off like anxiety within me. It would be this sense of dread that I'd feel straight away. Now, an alarm is supposed to wake you up and get you into a certain mood for a morning. That's what it's supposed to achieve. That is very, very bad audio design. But you know, I mean, Apple, right? Apple know everything about design. They've got it right. They must have it right. They must know what they're doing with audio design. So I got my first iPhone about 3 years ago. And I love the fact that my alarm, to begin with, if I can get it here, the sound, here we go. That was the first alarm that I had on my iPhone, right? That does not say to me, you might want to get out of bed now, start the day, be happy. That kind of screams to me, wakes me out of sleep and goes, the submarine is sinking, right? But we're starting to get there. We're starting to kind of get this to a point where it is getting a lot better. So one of the more recent ones, there's a bit more of a dynamic range there. It's nicer. They've kind of thought more about the context of what it is that you're thinking of. And actually, props to the guys at Nokia and Microsoft, because if you listen to their alarms and their sounds on the phone now, they're beautifully textured, they're dynamic, they're quite soft and nice, but they've still got that slight piercingness so you can actually hear them amongst the hubbub. That is where we're sort of starting to get it right. And this is something that I think is definitely going to grow more in the future and something that we should be looking at a little bit more. And it's not only, there's also a part of audio design that should be about delighting our users. Has anybody seen Normal in Shoreditch before? It's a great site. Does anybody here not know what Shoreditch is? Okay, good. So Normal in Shoreditch is all about finding normal things in Shoreditch, which is incredibly difficult, like things like loo roll or a towel or a coffee that's filter coffee as opposed to some £6 extravagant cup of coffee. But when you go on the site, so I've got shared this. Yeah, this is quite funny looking at the site. But the second time I visited the site, I actually had my sounds turned up on the thing and was greeted by this when I went to the site. Oh, yeah. How brilliant is that? I mean, that is a perfect example of using sound to delight your users, right? I mean, because basically that was a great marketing tool as well, because as soon as I heard that, I'd shared it with a few people when I first saw it. As soon as I heard that, I sent it to everyone going, turn your speakers up, this is awesome. But it's just a really nice way of sort of crafting the experience a bit more and delighting the audience. And then, as I said, there's providing feedback, using audio to provide feedback. So one of the things that's quite common in theatre that you probably don't realize is to record the audience and then feedback that sound through the speakers. The idea behind this is that if you do this, it builds the reaction and makes it bigger. If you hear laughter, you're more likely to laugh. So if you hear, 20 people laughing, you're more likely to laugh. But if you hear that amplified so it sounds like 100 people are laughing, all of a sudden it's hilarious. This is a really nice idea of kind of feedback, this feedback loop with an audience. And I think that feedback is one of the things that we're starting to suss within audio design, within technology, especially apps. And on the web, we're getting web apps are quite often using this kind of idea of feedback and notifications, sound in notifications to get this across to the audience, which is quite nice. And what it does is it creates this nice crafted experience. Of course, you need fallbacks because not everyone listens to audio on the web, but it just makes it slightly better. And this is what we should be trying to achieve, is a nice crafted experience. Don't worry, I'm almost at the end. So there's one more area of theatre design that I just wanted to touch on very, very quickly. So Jocelyn Herbert is a name that kept on coming up when I was doing the research. She's a legendary set designer. You might not know her name, but you've probably seen some of her work. She did every major piece of theatre from about 1950s to 1990s. And a lot of what she does is quite often called minimalism, saying that we obviously strive for in the web. But so Lindsay Anderson, who's a famous director and writer who worked with Jocelyn, said she doesn't really think that there ought to be sets. This is not the same as minimalism. It simply means that the fewer elements there are on the stage, the more perfect each individual object needs to be. Which I think is a beautiful way of looking at pulling a design together. Or as Jocelyn herself sees it, what we were there to do was to present the play as close as possible to what the author intended, to use the minimum of scenery and props, i.e. only those that served the actors or the play, nothing that was there for decorative purposes only, unless the text or style of the play demanded it, which I think is an amazing way of looking at design and minimalism, and something that we could definitely take away and put into the work that we do. So this is a very brief dip into the world of set design and theatre design. I hope there's something that you've taken out of it. But the point is that, as I said, it's up to us to define what we're doing in the future, which is quite an exciting thing. And I think that we should be looking everywhere for inspiration on how we can make this better. I won't read the quote out, but Simon Collison did put it very succinctly in his article for the manual, which I think is brilliant. That idea of working with confidence, intelligent experimentation, at times even brilliance, to make what we do better, to make the web in the future. Or as Jocelyn Herbert puts it, there seems no right way to design a play, perhaps only a right approach. So let's work together to try and find the right approach. Thank you very much. That's been me.